ask him anything, he's going to be listening in if we need him. I know he sent you links to things about me, but I don't know what you've had time to look at. And I'm wondering before
Can
we
I
get...
hold it? Yeah, I'm sorry.
No,
Yes,
it's
yeah,
okay. I
go
just
ahead.
was wondering if you had questions for me before we start talking.
Yeah, just one question. I know you are a professor, you are active. I know that you had written several books, poems, maybe other kinds as well. And then I would like to know why you had accepted this particular assignment, because I would suspect that in your position, you would get many requests to do things of this kind. Was there anything special about this particular project that you volunteered to do this interview with me?
Thank you. There were several things. One was, as I know you've discovered also, Howard is very inviting visionary. You know, he has great drive for this project, and he really wanted me to be involved, and he's very engaged with my work. And so it wasn't sort of a general invitation. It was specific, and I kept putting him off because my life circumstances were a mess, and he kept coming back and looking for other ways that I could be involved. Another reason was that he came up with this idea, which I thought was very exciting, an opportunity to talk with you. I'm very interested in your work, and also, as Howard knows, I've done a series of conversations like this through Zoom that with people who are interesting. And I love that way of relating to people. And also I feel that it turns ideas that might be abstract or dry, it gives them life and vitality. It roots them in real life. So it was kind of thing that I wanted to do in general. And of course, I was thrilled to be able to do this with you. There were two other reasons. I have a personal stake in this, not in terms of my family. Both sides of my family, as far as I know, most of them had emigrated in the first decades of the 20th century. They came to the United States or Canada. So I didn't grow up with any tradition of people who had died during the war. But as an American Jew growing up in the 1960s and 70s, American Jewish identity was taught to me as being rooted in a certain idea of the Holocaust. And I think many of us were taught that the core of American Jewish identity, the core of what it meant to be a Jew, was to be alive after the Holocaust, which meant to turn Jewish identity into this negative thing that was rooted in horror. And I grew up being taught that, having survived the Holocaust, that's what made a really good person, was going through the Holocaust, dying in it, or surviving. And so my generation, of course, could never aspire to be good in that kind of way. But the least we could do is continue to define ourselves in those ways. And I never liked this definition of Jewish identity. I have a deep connection with Judaism as a religious tradition. I know Jewish history is very long. There are lots of atrocities in there. There are also wonderful things in it. And so even as a child, I was dissatisfied with this. And when I was in my 30s, I felt called upon to write a book in the voice of a woman whose name, the book is called The Book of Anna, coincidentally.
Yes, I wanted to find out why you... had chosen that word, that name?
I was told this. This is so strange. Maybe you'll be put off by it, but it's the truth. So I was had been writing all my life, trying to create a career as a poet through my 20s and into my 30s, had really not gotten anywhere. And I was fed up with the way that I wrote. And I was walking around, I just finished a master's in fine arts and poetry, and it was just like I'd had it with myself. And I thought to myself, I talked to myself, I said, you know, I can't stand the way I write. And then I heard a voice that said, why don't you write like someone else? I have never heard voices before or anything, but being a smartass, I immediately answered, well, like who? And to my surprise, the voice answered, and it gave me this name, Anna Ornstein, and it told me a little bit about who she was. And she was living in 1950s Prague, and she'd been in the
1950 what then?
50s in Prague. That was where she was living. She was a Czech German
In Prague,
Jew. I didn't
in
know
the
anything about
50s, yeah.
Yeah, I knew nothing about any of this stuff. And she'd been in the camps in her adolescence. And I was like, okay, that is an oddly specific voice. I better do this. And so I embarked on a years-long project to get to know who she was and what her
really
story
amazing.
was.
I will have to read that book. Do you mind?
No,
I will get hold of it somehow.
If Howard sends me your address, I will be happy to send you a copy.
Do you mind? I would love to read it very much. Yes.
So the last piece of it is that I was asked to, when I was in my 20s and 30s, before or maybe during when I was working on the Book of Anna, I can't remember the exact chronology, but I was invited to review a bunch of books about Holocaust poetry. And at that time, I had to think about what was I doing, what were we doing, what was the difference between doing it well and doing it badly, or did any kind of writing poetry about the Holocaust work? And I knew that I had my own feelings about this because when I was a kid, remember, so I grew up with the Holocaust being this thing in my family. And I also grew up writing poetry. And I learned that my parents weren't interested in my poetry, but if I told my mother that I had written a poem about the Holocaust, she would immediately start to tear up. And I thought, oh, wow, this is a very powerful thing. And
subject,
yes, I was a child without ethics. And so I really enjoyed telling her that I was writing about the Holocaust because it got this emotional reaction from her. But I kept that feeling of
amazing. Yes.
What is this? Like, is that really what I'm doing if I write about the Holocaust? Am I just jerking people around, or is there something that's worth doing?
Very interesting. So now you have the job of interviewing me. You know, because I anticipated this conversation, I certainly wrote a few things, but I am not going to read anything. Actually, I don't even have access to it, other than maybe the only way I would, if you would remain in contact with me, but I would have to read it because I don't have anything that would be written out, and it is on my pad, so I am not I am dependent on reading it. But also while I'm talking, and I recognize right away in the way I am speaking with you, that I want to tell you one thing about myself, which is that I had a stroke. And I don't know whether there is no reason why you would have known that, but I am unable to write. It's so I'm not going to give you the details how I do eventually learn to write. And another thing that may affect our communication is that I lose words. I have difficulty at times. I have that in my mind. I know exactly what I want to tell you, but I may not be able to articulate very much the way that I have it in my head.
Thank you.
Was that clear what I was
Totally
just
clear. And
clear?
it's not a problem at all. This is not a performance. It's a conversation.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes silences, I mean, everybody actually loses words, and sometimes those silences have meanings as well as the words do.
Yeah, no, but in my case, it is that the words are missing for me, but hopefully that will not be a problem. And it is important to me to hear you asking the question. So I suspect that you had read the book, so you know what Howard is interested in, namely you asking me questions that would help me articulate my ideas, whatever the question is whatever the question is involved in. Yeah. So you go ahead and then let me respond the best I can.
Thank you. And we have, based on what Howard has said and the book, there are 3 things that I'm hoping that we will talk about. And if we don't cover everything in this conversation, we can do it in other conversations, so we're not in pressure. But there are 3 big questions that relate to this book that I'm looking forward to talking with you about. One is arguments against artistic representation of the Holocaust. There are strong arguments. I've written about some of them myself. As you know, I've personally wrestled with them as a poet. Another is argument.
Could you say it again? Because
yes.
I am not aware. There are objections for representation because this is a sacred or so mysterious or so unknowable that we better not talk about it, or we should, or we have no business talking about it.
As near as I can tell, the objections come in several different varieties. They are all relate to what you just said, which is stay away or you'll mess it up, basically. But there are different flavors of that. So one flavor of it says, this is unspeakable, that if you represent it in any way, you are misrepresenting it and you are desecrating it. And the most sophisticated version of that would be kind of like what Maimonides says about why we shouldn't talk about God, that human language always makes us feel better, like we know things when we don't. It puts things into categories. It suggests that there are similarities between things. And so some people say you can't put the Holocaust into language without doing that to it. Another group of people, and Primo Levi is one of the people who said this, and I would imagine that it was one of the, he wrote very eloquently about his experiences in the camps, and then he killed himself. And one of the things that he said that
which is questionable. His suicide is questionable.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, definitely.
That's good to know. I will look into more of it. But he wrote that the only people who really have any business talking about this are the people who died.
Well, dead. Yes.
That's right. And so everybody else has varying degrees of you shouldn't be talking about it because you weren't really there. It's kind of like the genocide version of if you remember Woodstock, you weren't really there. So if you're alive, you can't really speak about the Holocaust because you weren't really there, even if you were there and suffered through it if you were a
Yeah,
survivor.
I have immediately a response here.
Please, what are you thinking?
No, I am thinking all along while I'm listening to you, because what I hear, and this is already what I had been listening to and responding to, that then those of us who survived, I am a survivor, I think you know that, those have no business being alive. There are experiences that are very, very difficult to articulate, but we have nothing else but our voices to tell you a story that we are determined to tell about. And I experience this kind of talking as one that would put us into the, we have to die because we have no business being alive. I don't want that future for myself. And coming back to the book itself, when Al Howard and the other person who is the editor of this book decided that they want to invite people to listen to the Holocaust in a new way, give it new voice. They said, we are very much afraid that this story, the Holocaust, will suffer the fate of all historical events. Eventually, they will be forgotten. That is how it happens. That I think, I never asked Howard that, but I would suspect that here is the word that I have, motivation, the motivation to write this book about which we are now talking about, the motivation must have been, I think I didn't discuss it with them, that they didn't want this book to suffer the fate of all historical events that eventually will go dead. What I call it now, from here on, you will be known only in historical books that teachers find in a library, because that is the only place that event is noted, and all they know about it, it happened to the 20th century, it happened in Europe, period. There will be nothing new. And I am of the very different view of that. I think this book was created in order for that fate and for the Holocaust not to suffer this particular expected fate, that all they will know about it will be a date, and it will be in a book in some library that you have to search for. And they said, maybe we can prolong the life of this event by having a new book with new voices, and that will help them to survive maybe for another generation and maybe for another one. I am sure eventually all events will die in that sense. We know some stories about the First World War, maybe from the grandparents from here, but it's becoming like, I am sure that that will be the case also. But now you and I are engaged in the discussion of a book that was the child of the brainchild, I would say, the brainchild of two people at least, who said, maybe if we find people who would be like artists, that is poets or essayists, who will associate to pictures that come from that period and now will be heard in a new and interpreted in a new way. Yes. So they gave us the opportunity to listen to these new artists, that is, poets and essayists. And that is what I am supposed to do and discuss with you.
And that's a beautifully eloquent response. So the two arguments against doing this that I gave you, those are the most extreme arguments. I would say the absolutist arguments or the purist arguments. There's other arguments that relate to what you just said that I'd like to just put out on the table. But to get there, I want to go backward, because we just celebrated Tisha B'Av. And Tisha B'Av, the observance of it, it not only involves a fast, but it involves the reading of a poem about the horrors of that historical event. It is a first-person rendition. It's in the voice of somebody who did not die, right? So answering Primo Levi, it's somebody who didn't die in that event. We read it, and I think it was included in the Torah for the very reasons that you said, which is that poetry has the capacity to keep what would otherwise become history and feel like that was then and it's more and more general, to keep it fresh and keep us grounded in something of the sense of how it was lived. So there is a long precedent that supports what you were saying within Jewish tradition. So now I want, go ahead, please. No, tell me.
No, I am just thinking that we Jews, maybe because we had so many incidents, so many events that we had to remember, we found a way of doing that by make the event and its memory into a day of fasting.
That's right.
In other words, but then the question is, are we losing our way in which we used to remember?
Can you say more about that? That's a profound question.
No, I tell you, interestingly, because I cannot write anymore, it came to me in terms of my own experiences. And that is, I was thinking about the loss of the Shabbat. We should, now, even at the time, that is the book I am, Heschel.
That's Heschel's book, The Sabbath?
The Shabbat, yeah. And I was thinking, we should really recognize that modern man knows about the feelings, the meanings of having a Shabbat when you don't do anything that is the ordinary. Because I grew up, in an Orthodox home, and it is natural that once you go to the university and you have a practice and you have children, what do you do with your day of Shabbat? You need to cook. because you're working on, or you go shopping, because when else will you have time to do those things? So now, when you see the Tisha B'Av, naturally, I am thinking about my father and all the times that was naturally. But I myself now, only one generation away, I don't even remember on the day on which it occurs. So I don't know whether or not we Jews are going to join the other group of people who don't really care about their important days that separated some day from another day.
Yeah, I think that you're raising, this is really a profound cluster of questions about the fact that, well, as a poet, right? If I write a poem, I think of the effect of that poem, not that it's going to be part of a biblical canon or people will celebrate holidays and read the poem. In other words, I think of it as something that individuals will read, if I'm lucky, and they'll have an experience. So that is
Yes.
a very different, it's a secular, modern, individualized, I would say even capitalist way of thinking about artistic expression and what it can do. And as you're pointing out, that limits the very quality of memory and meaning that you can have, that something like Shabbat, and I would say also the traditional Tisha B'Av observance, because they're communal. And I'm thinking of the two versions of the 10 Commandments in the Torah. One says, keep the Shabbat, one says, do it, and the other says, remember it. And so it's the combination of remembering it and being in a community that does it together that creates possibilities for kinds of memory, I would say, and
Yes.
kinds of experience that we certainly should be worried about losing. And that, in a certain way, because I hadn't thought of this before, so I'm sorry, I'm freelancing here. You've stimulated new thinking, which I'm grateful for. So I was going to point out that one of the another objection, there were two more objections to Holocaust poetry that I was going to propose.
Yeah.
One
Yes.
is, I think, important but trivial compared to what we're talking about. So I'm going to say it, and then I think we can probably move on. One is that anything that you do in a capitalist society, or that individual artists create things, or publishers publish books, it has an element of profit. And some people have talked about, how they talk about show business, show up business. So that this is a way that people can gain fame, gain publications, gain whatever it is, cultural esteem that individuals can get. So that is one of the objections, that it may be necessary
Like a
that
business.
people do this, like a business, right? Because what would keep, I will confess to you, do I wish the Book of Anna had been a New York Times bestseller? Yes, I do. Of course I do. That's the culture that I grew up in. That was the model of success as a poet. Did I think
Exactly.
that was is that a good, relation to it? I wouldn't say so, but it's what my culture gives me for this endeavor. The more profound question, though, and I'm thinking about differently in relation to what you just said, is if you read Lamentations, if you read Eicha, you notice that it uses highly conventionalized language. It uses the same images over and over again. Not only that, but the images that it uses, you can find in the biblical curses that are in Deuteronomy. You can find them in other prophets, right? The culture, the poetic culture of ancient Israel, as most poetic traditional cultures are, it's not about innovation. It's about conventions. You have a bunch of phrases and images that have deep meaning, and you put them together in different ways. So the more profound question about Holocaust poetry is that it generates its own cliches, that it takes the events, it puts them into words, And then those words become formulas. So in the ancient culture, in the sacred culture that Echa comes out of and that still lives in some Jewish communities, you can say, yeah, that's right. That's the way this works, right? Prayers are conventional language that we give deep meaning to because it's sustained by a community. But one of the arguments against writing Holocaust poetry is you're just generating cliches. And so you're reducing, you're not adding to the ability to remember. You're not adding to the ability to talk and think about this. You're actually taking it away. Every time somebody writes a poem where there's the image of smoke from a gas chamber, the readers of that poem say, oh, yeah. Holocaust, smoke from a gas chamber. I've heard it all before. And that to me feels like it relates to what you said about what is the capacity for memory that we have and that we need. And are we losing the kind of memory that we need?
Now, Joy, let me ask you with this, the very last image,
yes.
Smoke from the chimneys. Interestingly, for me, the image is helpful for the memory. Maybe because I actually had seen it. But I am grateful for the poet's ability to give it expression so that you too can imagine the smoke. So why would we deprive ourselves of the possibility to articulate, to find forms and ways of saying something that brings it to your image, because it's not your memory, but now you do have a picture of it. And at least you have that picture. I tell you, one of the things that I found very interesting how are the very famous artists remembered? You take not Cézanne, but the very famous new modern painter,
like Picasso?
Picasso. Because everybody who goes to a museum had seen the Picasso. And it is interesting, I looked into that. What is the picture, the image that most people will remember among the many, many hundreds and thousands of pictures they had seen from Picasso? It will be the Guernica. People remember, and then they remember that event that is commemorated by that picture. And you think, how come? This was a horrendous story. People want to remember that story. And now they have an image that helps them remember. That's when they go to the museum and say, oh, this is Guernica. This is what happened there. And I would say, we have to say, that is what happened there. So that's why people go to, maybe to Auschwitz, looking up. That's where it happened.
So I love the idea that you just articulated, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're saying that images, both the visual artistic images, as opposed to like the photographs in New Voices, which I want to talk about in a minute, or going to Auschwitz, right? So photographs or going to the location, that's giving yourself a first-person experience of some kind of how this looked, not how it felt or what it was like to live there, but how it looked. But artistic images, artistic representations, you're saying have a different function for you, which is a poetic image or a painting like Guernica gives an artistic form that enables people in future generations and people who've lived through the events to be connected through this form
Yes,
and that is actually what the poem Lamentations does, what Echa does. You know, it
yes,
is true that it's a convention that it says, you know, women eating their own children that they've just given birth to. When you read about the horrible sieges in the Iron Age, that's what they would do. They would starve people to that extent. But there is a way in which that image, to this unimaginable level of horror and desperation, continues somehow to bind the generations
that's
together.
right. That's right. And that's what we can, and I tell you, we are in a way in our terrible situation as Jews because we were exposed to so many of these events that we also have the ability to articulate with voices, with new voices, as Howard would say, that we can find images, that the images can be now accompanied with new voices and new people who read the Lamentations, and
Yes.
people like myself who don't even remember the date on which it happened. But we know the event. We don't know the date.
Right.
And we
Wonderful.
have to not celebrate, but remember both the first, the destruction of one temple and on the second temple.
That's right. Yeah. When I had my first child, and he was 3, I think, when he was able to celebrate his first holidays. And so I was aware of these holidays in a new way. And first, there was Purim, and I thought, oh my God, this is a holiday that makes it fun to talk about genocide. And then I realized, I mean, I was like, oh my God, right. As a Jewish parent, I have to have a little fun holiday so my child learns how to deal with it if they try to kill you all. And then a month later, we have Passover, where there's another genocide that we're remembering. This one is another failed one, but not a failed one. 400 years of slavery, as African Americans will tell us, is no picnic, right? It's not the same as genocide, but it's a horrible thing to go through. And I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I just want to say, you know, this is making me laugh a little bit because I think that we Jews should celebrate every day our ability to articulate that we have to remember.
Mm. Yes.
That we have
Mm.
the base to do that. I mentioned to Howard, he wasn't particularly interested in the story, but I happened to write a foreword to an other book very recently to a group of people who don't have a written language. Now, everything comes only, they only remember what they can tell from their grandparents, and maybe eventually it will be remembered, but yes and no. So there are cultures now in this world, many of them, who don't have a written way of remembering. who create their first generation will be the ones who escaped from Africa, came to this country, and learned to read and write. We Jews, maybe we got it from the Arabs, we were not the first ones, that we were so excited by the ability to write, we never stopped. Get a Jew and he will tell you a story, and the story will be written down very quickly.
That's right.
And I am glad for it and proud of it.
That feels to me like a powerful rebuttal of the first two objections to this.
Yes, I'm glad.
And also, it sounds like you're saying that whatever the risks of representation, it's a function of actually being alive and surviving. And it's something that we do because we don't only exist as individuals. I think that it is questionable if I, as an individual poet, say, oh, my career is going nowhere. I know I should write about the Holocaust. People will love that. That's an obscene thing to do. However, collectively, whatever the motivations of the individual artists to engage in this, and there's nothing about being an artist that makes you a great human being or anything. We're all just as complicated and human as anyone else, but nonetheless, artists are the way our species does this together. Like, we have to do it because being an artist, being a poet, means that you're in the business of creating these images and of giving form to events and feelings. And you might be doing it for the worst reasons, you might not be doing it well, but nonetheless, it's still your job to do it as part of a people and as part of a species that requires this, I would say, to live. When I was writing this article about what good Holocaust poetry might be like, right, this oxymoronic thing as a literary critic, like if you said to Picasso, all right, Pablo, we want you to paint a response to Guernica, the atrocity at Guernica. And he said, well, how can you do that? That's just a horrific thing. No, but there are photographs. Just look at the photographs. I don't want to do anything to change the image. What would make a good painting about Guernica? And one of the things that is striking about that painting is that the horror in it is tied up with a language of images that is very, very hard to process. I've seen that painting many times, and I never remember it. I can't remember it. The composition is designed to make it feel chaotic and to rupture the systems of meaning where, I don't know, like, that beautiful, one of Cézanne's apples or something like that. I remember the apple. It's lovely. I couldn't paint it, but it's not like I can't remember that the painting of an apple is a painting of an apple. But with Guernica, I literally can't remember what there is. I remember the feeling of it. But every time I see it, I have to process it anew.
This is important. Beautiful. Very good. Very good.
So I know that you,
how long we've been talking?
Oh my gosh.
Almost an hour. That I know that I love to talk to you more. I love to listen to you more.
That feeling is mutual. I know that in your writing, it feels like, I think we're just going to sort of get to the beginning of the other part of the conversation I wanted to have. So maybe Howard will schedule another session for us where we can talk about how New Voices works, and we'll look at that sample poem together.
That is really was our job, yeah.
I don't think he will mind what we talked about. I suspect he's liking it. But what I
was very organized, and totally different content than what we ended up talking about. Very different.
Me
What
too.
I had in mind. You too.
Here's
So
my
maybe
list.
this should be more. This should maybe be more, what I would say, disciplined and stick to the task that we were assigned.
Well, I feel like what we just did really very well talked about the pros and cons of this debate about artistic representation. So I
That
feel like
is
we've
the
now sort
question.
of set the table for this. And where we've ended up
Okay.
with is you and I were in agreement that part of what art is doing is different from what photographs do. It's different from what visits to the sites of atrocities do, because it's creating forms that have to be re-assimilated by individuals. So it is creating an event that happens inside the people who read Holocaust poetry. And so in our next conversation, I'm hoping that we can talk about, because I know you're an expert on this.
I am not sure, because I don't see myself expert in anything in particular.
That's my
Maybe
favorite kind
in
of expert.
child psychiatry, I have some, not in art. I just enjoy it and try to understand it. But, you know, my whole life was just writing very ordinary things, what happens to people, like when they get well, not well, when they are not well. And mainly I was working with families and children who had emotional problems. It was not art. No, my job was not even related. It's interesting that Howard found that one article that you may have seen, but that is really the only one in which I engaged the issue of art. Because I am not an artist, I didn't feel myself, but it is a funny, you know, most of these things go back to a story. I simply walked into a bookstore and I saw a very large book, and it cost a lot of money, over $100, one book. When we have so many books in our house, the last thing I needed was another book. But this was an amazing book. This book was a catalog that was prepared by one of the universities near Chicago. They had an exhibit of all the, you've probably seen that book, that all the art that was created in and around and in connection with the Holocaust. And I said, I didn't wait another minute. I bought that book right away. And that is where I learned quite a bit of why art became so important, even to the people who were incarcerated. Now I see how important it was and for what purpose. And maybe we should talk a little bit more about that too.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I just want to
Maybe.
say, I admire the essay that you wrote greatly. And I as a poet, I felt like you understood very deeply the different impulses to make art in circumstances of excruciating suffering.
Yeah, and how did you visit Auschwitz?
No,
No,
I haven't.
you haven't. No, if case you ever do, you will be surprised. There is a museum in Auschwitz. You heard about that. And that in itself is an amazing story. And how that happened, that there was a museum, because the person who was found to paint a horse, but he was not allowed to paint anything other than he was told to paint. That could painting that horse was a no-no. And they took him to the head person in Auschwitz, and they thought he will be killed right on the spot for doing something that he was not supposed to do. That was the punishment, was in a place like Auschwitz, that you know. In any case, this man was not a Jewish man, but he was a political prisoner. And to save his life, he made up a story, a very clever one. He said, you know, sir, what we need here for our officers, we need a museum. We should, yeah, why not? And there were all these people who were making all kinds of pieces that would, I would love to tell you more about it, how I learned about what that museum was and what it became. Now, if you ever go to Auschwitz, you can see that museum, because there is one. And people say, what? A museum in Auschwitz? Yes.
It is really extraordinary that on the one hand, you have the prisoners for whom making art was a way of maintaining humanity and surviving. It was a survival and a resistance strategy. But you also had the people who were working there who were in a very different way being dehumanized and needing, maybe not deserving, but needing art also as a way of remaining in touch with their humanity.
Exactly. You know what, Joy? We do have to stop, simply because if it is left up to our need to talk, like the women who were in the same cellar in the Gefängnis, I say certain things in German. Do you speak German? No.
I don't, no.
Gefängnis is just, it's a